As Steve has already mentioned, the Energy Transformation Implementation Unit worked closely with the Australian Energy Market Operator, Western Power and EY's Power and Utilities team to undertake the detailed modelling of what future demand in the SWIS might look like and determine a least cost mix of existing and new infrastructure required to meet it, while also making sure that system security and reliability requirements are met over a 20-year period. The whole of system plan is the most comprehensive modelling study ever undertaken into the future of the SWIS, using a resource planning model to produce a draft lowest cost supply mix, then putting that mix through a dispatch model that replicates the wholesale electricity market, or WEM, for each of the 4 different scenarios. Again, as Steve said, delivery of this first whole of system plan would not have been possible without the input of many different stakeholders. Western Power provided the initial inputs for the 4 scenarios, including assumptions around economic and population growth, take-up of new technologies such as DER and home automation, which produced different demand profiles for each scenario for each 30-minute interval over 20 years. These demand profiles were modified to account for seasonal impacts and behind-the-meter PV production by using 9 years of historical weather data, including satellite-derived solar data on a 5-kilometre grid across the whole SWIS. The SUU project team met with many stakeholders over months and months to test all the inputs and assumptions we were using for existing facilities, for new generation options, and as well as talking to those who are developing newer technologies and in the financing and investment side of the sector. AEMO and Western Power spent many hours determining the technical envelope that the SWIS must operate within, with EY advising how to best incorporate these requirements into the modelling. The SUU team were engaging across the other energy transformation strategy work streams that Steve mentioned to make sure that we could incorporate as many of the WEM market design features as possible. AEMO developed dynamic essential system service, or ESS, constraints, while Western Power provided network constraints, noting that these network constraints were only for transfer between the 11 transmission planning zones, not within them, that were being used in the resource planning model. The resource planning model simulated SWIS operation over 20 years and determined the least cost investment plan for generation, network and storage in the SWIS based on our demand and cost assumptions. The resource planning model includes constraints for frequency regulation raise and lower and contingency reserve raise and lower, as well as a minimum inertia constraint. Even while running machines simultaneously, it took 120 hours for the resource planning model to calculate the 4 scenarios. There is no way that a modelling exercise of this scope would be possible without the latest in computing technology, and even then we managed to break it a few times. Western Power then created new network constraint equations accounting for the network and generation built under the resource planning model. The dispatch model was run with resource planning model outputs and new network constraints, and as Steve said, the model co-optimised the dispatch of energy and essential system services as per the new WEM design, with the ESS requirement for each interval set based on the amounts determined by the resource planning model. Results from the dispatch model were then assessed using a commercial assessment test, which looked at the energy, ESS and capacity revenues for new generation and storage facilities, and tested this against an external rate of return in order to assess whether they were commercially viable. The final investment plan was adjusted as required to ensure that the final mix is likely to be feasible. Detailed information on the modelling inputs, assumptions and methodology are available at the Brighter Energy Future website, which will be provided later. The 4 demand scenarios were chosen to provide a relatively wide scope of possible outcomes, but with somewhat credible boundaries, noting that with a 20-year study there is much uncertainty as to what 2040 looks like, so we were most interested in the results over the next 5 to 10 years. This graph shows the annual operational demand for each of the 4 scenarios against the past 4 years of actual demand, which was supplied by the SWIS. The 2020 Electricity Statement of Opportunities for the WEM, released in June, forecasts that the net average annual growth in operational demand is in fact negative 0.4% over the next 10 years. In our scenarios, Castaway has an annual average reduction in demand of around 1.1% as economic growth is low and there is large-scale disconnection from the grid. Groundhog Day has relatively flat operational demand. It reduces by 0.2% per year due to the high uptake of DER, rooftop PV and other behind-the-meter technologies, which essentially meets all of the demand growth. Techtopia sees overall operational demand grow due to economic and population growth, but the uptake of home automation and other technologies in place of PV produces a flatter daily demand profile. And double bubble, the yellow line at the top, sees operational demand triple from current levels as all sectors of the economy grow strongly. Population also grows strongly, but is more concentrated in the south of the Swiss and metro area. The generation mix at the start of the modelling includes 524 megawatts of new wind and solar capacity, which is currently being commissioned or in operation. The Warradage and Yandon wind farms, the Greenock River solar expansion, and the new Merredin solar farm. The overall proportion of installed renewable capacity by the end of 2020 is 34%, with more than half of this from rooftop PV. Under all scenarios, most of the new generation capacity installed is renewable, as it is selected based on the lowest overall system cost, and renewable generation has the lowest operating costs. Rooftop PV and other renewables displace thermal generation. Coal generation output declines, while gas plays a greater role in firming intermittency and supporting renewables. No new thermal capacity is installed in either Castaway or Groundhog Day, but between 667 and 867 megawatts of new gas capacity is installed in the higher demand scenarios. This is still substantially less than the new renewable capacity installed in these scenarios. Storage is installed in all scenarios, initially to provide essential system services and as a provider of energy and capacity in later years, and it also serves to delay or avoid additional network investment. By 2040, renewables, excluding storage, comprises over 70% of total generation capacity under all scenarios.
Thanks, Brooke. We're now going to have a look at the capacity mix across the 4 scenarios in a little more detail, with a focus on the capacity outcomes for each of the different technology types in the model. So on the slide you see now, on the top row, we have our 2 lower demand scenarios, Castaway and Groundhog Day. And on the bottom row, you have the higher demand scenarios in Techtopia and Double Bubble. And what you can see there is there's really a strong correlation between demand and the amount of capacity built, with obviously a lot more, especially in Double Bubble, than in the ones up top. So the capacity mix today, we start on the left of those charts there, which it may not look like much in that when compared to where we end up in some of the scenarios, but that does account for over 3,000 megawatts of gas and cogeneration, another 1,500 megawatts of coal, 1,200 megawatts of large-scale renewables, and around 1,300 megawatts of rooftop solar PV as well. It's important to note here that rooftop PV was an input into the model, so it's included on these charts, but the rest of the measures there are all outputs from the modelling, so not to be confused between the two. So in the lower demand scenarios there, we're seeing a reduction in thermal capacity over the study period in the lowest cost generation mix, both due to end-of-life plant retirements and also the early withdrawal of some coal capacity for economic reasons. And then there is a modest increase in large-scale renewables, mostly wind, and a large increase in rooftop PV capacity that you can see in the yellow there. And there's also the introduction of battery storage, bits at the top of the graph there. In the high demand scenarios, the end-of-life thermal capacity retirements are offset a bit by the introduction of some flexible gas capacity, and there is no early economic closure of coal capacity. Rooftop PV growth in these scenarios was assumed to be a bit lower than in the first 2 scenarios, and so we see a pretty substantial build-up of large-scale solar PV and wind capacity and battery storage to meet demand. As Brooke demonstrated a couple of slides ago, renewable generation really dominates the capacity mix by 2040 in all 4 scenarios. So in the lower demand scenarios, and especially in Groundhog Day, these are characterized by high rooftop PV growth, which again was a fixed input into the model. And this tends to crowd out new large-scale generation investment, as there is not much demand and not much requirement for more capacity than what is provided by this rooftop PV. And now this crowding out effect is especially pronounced for large-scale solar PV. There's very little installed there at all. And as you already have a huge amount of sort of rooftop PV generation producing during the time of day when solar farms would be coming online, coupled with relatively low grid demand, that extra capacity that they would provide is just less valuable to the system as a whole than other forms of generation where they're selected. In the higher demand scenarios, sorry, we're seeing a bit less rooftop solar PV coming in and as an input, and we have much more demand, and that therefore we're seeing a lot more space for the introduction of new capacity, and especially as you can see there, large-scale solar in the orange bar there. And you can see it's almost keeping pace with wind capacity over the study period when there is a lot of demand in the system. Speaking of wind, it's the only large-scale generation technology that we saw being added in all 4 scenarios. We also saw batteries being added in all 4, but of the pure generation types, wind was the only one that came across in all of them. In Castaway, there's not a huge amount of any new capacity being added, so there's only a small amount of wind capacity being added there. But in the scheme of things, in the context of there being very little overall, that explains the relatively low amount of wind there. It should be noted as well, as Brooke noted earlier, that the model included the recently constructed Yandin and Warradaji wind farms right from the start, so that accounts for around 400 megawatts of capacity that's just entered the system. In Groundhog Day, all new generation capacity is wind capacity, and we see around nearly 1,000 megawatts coming in by 2040 of wind. In the higher demand scenarios, as discussed on the previous slide, wind and large-scale solar make up the bulk of new generation additions, and there is more wind capacity at the end of the study period than there is any other type of generation technology. Now, an interesting outcome of the modelling we found is that despite excellent wind resources we have in the north of the Swiss, the model would build most new wind generation in the southwest of the state. This is because there is greater network capacity in the southwest, and the wind resource there is still very good. So the least cost model determined that increasing network capacity to connect new wind projects in the North Country would be less efficient than utilising the existing network capacity that we have in the southwest. This also provides a more diverse wind profile for the Swiss as a whole, with wind coming in from different locations. And there's also more energy market revenue available for projects built in the south, as there's more network available there. Now to batteries. So due to the scale of the charts here, you can't really see too well in some cases, but batteries are built immediately across all 4 scenarios, and they continue to play an important part as more renewables connect to the grid. In fact, batteries were the only technology type we saw being built in the first year of the study in 2021, and continuing to be built as part of the lowest cost capacity mix. So the WASP included 3 different candidate technologies for storage as a whole. There were 2-hour duration batteries that were able to be discharged 2 hours of their nameplate capacity. They're 4-hour duration batteries, and also a 10-hour duration storage option that was based on the hydro and compressed air storage technologies. The model, however, only chose the battery options, and this was a result of our input assumptions. CapEx was lower for batteries than for the longer duration storage, and the fast response time they had also allowed them to competitively essential system services. Longer duration storage was also limited as a candidate to a handful of different locations in the grid due to the unique topography that's required for pumped hydro storage, and also the small number of suitable sites for compressed air storage technology, whereas batteries were able to be built at any of the different 11 transmission network zones that we use. So in the first years of the modelling, most of the battery storage built is the 2-hour duration batteries, and that's due to its lower capex compared to the 4-hour duration storage. So its ability to provide ESS right away. In particular, they captured the majority of the frequency regulation market, which is currently referred to as the load following ancillary service. And that's due to their sort of ability to respond near instantly to frequency fluctuations. Later on in the study, as more renewables connect to the grid, we see more 4-hour batteries coming in particularly in the higher demand scenarios, is able to participate more in the energy and capacity markets and provide firming for that additional renewable uptake. As mentioned earlier, there's currently around 3,000 megawatts of gas and cogeneration in the Swiss, and in the lower demand scenarios, this remains relatively flat, except for the end-of-life retirement of some facilities in the 2030s. And this existing gas capacity does continue to be active in the energy markets, in the ESS markets and capacity markets. This is due to its flexibility, where it can compete in all those markets, and it can contribute as well to the firming of that increased level of intermittent generation. Although batteries do take a lot of the share for regulation, these gas facilities are still very active in the ESS markets and important going forward. In the higher demand scenarios, we do see the introduction of a few hundred megawatts of additional flexible gas capacity with parameters based on reciprocating engine technology, which is a bit flexible, more modular than some of the facilities out there at the moment. But this uptake is much lower than the uptake we see of large-scale renewables. And now I'll hand back to Brooke to talk about the outlook for coal-fired generation.
Coal-fired electricity has been declining as a proportion of overall electricity generation for much of the past decade, largely due to the changing daily demand profile due to the uptake of rooftop PV and the introduction of new lower-cost generation from large-scale wind. As coal-fired plants are being cycled more often during the course of the day or being turned on and off, the operation and maintenance costs increase, making them less competitive with other generation types and ultimately less economically viable. Under all four scenarios, the proportion of coal-fired electricity generation declines, and under the lower demand scenarios, up to 500 megawatts of coal-fired capacity exits the lowest cost mix. We can see this better on the next slide. The closure of the Mujasi units in 2022 and 2024, as announced by government in August 2019, is built into the modelling for all four scenarios. This reduces coal generation capacity from 1569 megawatts to 1178 megawatts, which is shown in the yellow bar. Under Groundhog Day, a further 132 megawatts of coal capacity would no longer feature in the lowest cost to supply on top of the Mujasi retirements from 2025. Under Castaway, in which demand for grid-supplied electricity is declining, another 500 megawatts of coal capacity is removed from the mix from 2025, in addition to the Mujasi units, which would mean a total coal capacity reduction of 57% from the start of the modelling period. The model allows coal capacity to be retired on a per megawatt basis, while in reality, any decision on retirement will need to be made on a unit or facility basis and will depend on a range of factors which were not included in the modelling. There is sufficient renewable and gas capacity available to meet demand and ESS requirements when this generation capacity leaves the system in the lower demand scenarios. I might just pause for a second so that you can review the slide. If we move on to the next slide, we look at the outcome of this coal retirement. As was noted in the WASP Scenarios information paper, which we published in August 2019, one of the modelling outputs is an emissions profile for the technology mix that eventuates under each of the four scenarios. Overall emissions fall most rapidly in the lower demand scenario. However, overall emissions reduce under all four scenarios, even in those that see a significant increase in operational demand. By 2040, the total emissions reductions are 41% in Castaway, 29% in Groundhog Day, 13% in Techtopia, and 17% in Double Bubble. However, emissions intensity, which is the amount of carbon dioxide equivalent attributed to the production of a megawatt hour of electricity, decreases by at least 50% under all scenarios. This is due to the continued introduction of renewable generation and the use of storage in place of thermal generation. Emissions intensity declines from over 0.6 tonnes CO2 per megawatt hour to between 0.3 and 0.18 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per megawatt hour, depending on the scenario. The biggest factor in reducing emissions is retirement of thermal generation, either due to economic drivers or reaching the technical end of life. As I mentioned earlier, the WASP only considered transmission network augmentations required to increase the transfer capacity between the 11 transmission planning zones. Distribution network, transmission network within the zones, or reinforcements required for system security were not part of the modelling. The model does not build any new transmission network in the lower demand scenarios, as the relatively small amounts of new generation capacity required are built in areas where there is available network capacity. However, in the higher demand scenarios, where mining growth sees electricity demand in the Eastern Goldfields region and population growth in metro and southern parts of the Swiss, we see similar network investments made in both Techtopia and Double Bubble. 290 megawatts of additional network capacity is built between Muja and the Eastern Goldfields by 2025, which allows more energy to be supplied from the southwest and also for new generation capacity to be added in the Eastern Goldfields. As there is significant new wind capacity being installed in the southwest in these scenarios, once the existing network capacity is full, an extra 1,250 megawatts transfer capacity is built between the southwest and metro zones by 2028 to 29. This southwest to metro augmentation was much cheaper than the other options, especially augmenting the North Country. However, towards the end of the study period, when network demand is double to triple current levels in Techtopia and Double Bubble, a series of augmentations are made in the northern zones.
All right, so now we're going to have a look at the outlook for essential system services, or ESS. Obviously, as we have more renewables coming into the grid, we do see a substantial increase in the ESS requirements to ensure system stability as that intermittent generation is added. The WASP model did include dynamic ESS requirements that were able to be adjusted depending on the amount of renewable capacity on the system. These were the parameters for this were provided by AEMO based on historical market data. So a good illustration of how this worked is provided in this slide here, showing the change in the average frequency regulation, what's currently called load following ancillary service requirements over time. So frequency regulation, is required to account for the differences between generation output forecasts and actual generation output. So as we have more of that intermittent generation added to the system, those forecasting errors can become bigger, which increases the requirement for the service. So at night time, this increased variability is driven by additional wind capacity. So you can see in the blue bar there, the nighttime requirement for frequency regulation. In the lower demand scenarios, these increases in new wind capacity are fairly modest. So you see that the nighttime requirement stays pretty flat throughout the study period. However, in the high demand scenarios, you can see a pretty dramatic increase as a lot more new wind capacity is added to the system. During the daytime, solar generation can also add to this variability. So the regulation requirement is greater than it is at nighttime, and it increases as new solar capacity is added, as well as when new wind capacity is added. In the charts there, the yellow columns represent the additional requirement in the daytime over and above what you require at night. So the total daytime requirement is given by the yellow and blue columns combined. So for example, in Castaway there, the daytime requirement increases from a bit over 100 megawatts to over 300 megawatts by the end of the study period in 2040. Now we see the daytime requirement is also increasing rapidly in the lower demand. It's primarily driven by that very high rooftop PV growth you see in that. And you can even see in Groundhog Day, we reach kind of the limit of the effect that that rooftop PV can have on the ESS requirements overall due to the technical capability of the system. So on the next slide, we look at the revenue available in the ESS markets, as well as, which is also the total cost of those markets for consumers. So despite the large increase in ESS requirements we showed on the previous page, we don't see a proportionate increase in ESS costs over the study period. We have a larger pool of generation and battery storage facilities that are able to provide ESS services, and they can often do so at lower cost than current providers. So this kind of highlights the importance as well of work being carried out by our colleagues in the Foundation Regulatory Frameworks workstream of the Energy Transformation Strategy to design and implement these new ESS markets. Also highlights that new revenue streams may be available from ESS markets for both new facilities, but also existing facilities that are capable of providing those services due to their technical characteristics, but don't currently do so. So the WASP model, the co-optimized dispatch of energy, and the new ESS markets being implemented as part of the energy transformation strategy. These markets are frequency regulation, raise and lower, which is roughly equivalent to the current load following service as discussed earlier, and the contingency reserve, raise and lower services, which equate to the current spinning reserve and load rejection reserve services. New rock-off control, rate of change and frequency control market wasn't explicitly included as a market, but a minimum inertia constraint was used in the modelling to account for the effects of the service. So our modelling assumed that all technically capable facilities would be able to provide the services, and we also allowed renewable generators to provide the contingency reserve lower service or the current load rejection reserve service. And that accounts for the sort of reduced market cost for this service due to the low short-run marginal cost of these renewable facilities. So the chart shows the available ESS revenues, which are also the overall market costs in the Groundhog Day scenario. Market costs here initially increase, although not as fast as the requirements for ESS increased, as we saw in the previous chart. And this is due to the more competitive provision of ESS by lower cost providers. Then you can see there's also a step change in 2026 as we have close to 100 megawatts of new battery capacity added in that year, driven by a decrease in capex for battery facilities. And these systems come in and provide ESS, particularly frequency regulation, at lower cost than the existing providers, which reduces the overall revenue stream for the service. And then as we go on in the years following that, we see that the costs then for the market gradually increase again as ESS requirements increase. But again, it's that gradual increase due to the more competitive provision of the service. So speaking of batteries, here we see the sort of build up again in Groundhog Day over the entire 20 years of the study period across our 11 transmission network zones. So you can see that they're quite well dispersed throughout the grid. So starting from the left there, those who have read the report all the way through will know that we have North Country on the left, and then Midwest, Mirrabut, and so on, all the way through to the Southwest and Southeast on the right. So as discussed earlier, we're seeing around 50 megawatts of 2-hour duration batteries added in the first year of the study. And at this stage, they primarily provide ESS, particularly frequency regulation, due to their very fast response time. The capex for 2-hour batteries is lower than the capex for 4-hour batteries, and longer duration isn't really required for that service. So we see the 2-hour batteries being selected by the model in the early years there. So up until around the mid-20s, we're mostly seeing 2-hour batteries, and then from then on, we see a lot more 4-hour batteries being added. As a very high rooftop PV growth continues, especially in this Groundhog Day scenario. And these longer duration batteries are able to soak up more of that midday load, providing energy and competing the capacity markets as well as ESS. So the next slide really displays that a lot better, in that it shows the revenues for batteries as a whole over the first 10 years of the study period. So initially, when they come in, we see they're almost entirely reliant on that ESS revenue, as the 2-hour systems come in and they take a large share of that frequency regulation market. But over time, as more 4-hour batteries are added to the capacity mix, we start to see capacity and energy revenue really taking up a larger share of that overall revenue stack in the dark and lighter blues there. So it's not just in total as well, but also as a proportion of your overall battery revenue. These revenue streams, again, are very dependent on work being done in the energy transformation strategy, not only to enable the registration and participation of battery systems in the WEM, but also to design and implement new ESS markets and to make changes to the reserve capacity mechanism that will allow for the accreditation of storage systems with capacity credits to really highlight the value they add to the network with that capacity. So yeah, I think this chart really highlights some of the benefits of work being done by some of our colleagues elsewhere in energy transformation strategy. And now finally, we've referred a few times now to the WASP being a least cost model, but how did we determine that least cost solution? We had different cost types, cost assumptions included in the model for every existing plant in the Swiss, as well as for potential new entrants, relating to each plant's fuel costs, their operation and maintenance costs, and potential rehab costs in the case of plant closure. The model also included assumed capital costs for new entrants, and a cost associated with any unserved energy. So we found typically the largest driver of overall per unit costs was the fuel costs, but capital costs were also a significant driver of overall costs, and they largely account for the higher per unit cost of energy in the Techtopia and double bubble scenarios, the higher demand scenarios, as these included much higher capital expenditure on new plant than in the lower demand scenarios. So you can see there's about a $10 a megawatt hour gap roughly between them. So the model really shows that we can manage the energy transition in a cost-effective manner, with per unit costs typically reducing by the end of the study period if we have the right mix of technologies and network going forward. And for our final slide, we like to finish on this one because it really just gives an indication of the level of some of the detail, the granularity that went into the WASP modelling. So the demand modelling from Western Power that we used for the WASP scenarios included data for each individual interval in the 20-year study period. And we're also able to use 9 years of, again, interval data for historical weather data on a locational basis. So we could include individual solar and wind output traces for each interval. So instead of using, say, a demand profile that would repeat day for day for every day over a month or seasonally, we're able to really stress test the system by looking at variable data for each interval, looking at potentially high ramping between intervals, and also to observe how the system would respond under different conditions, such as what is displayed in this slide. So here we have kind of a random 2-day period in 2032 in the Techtopia scenario, where we have a markedly different output from renewable generation from day 1 to day 2. So in the first day, we have the sun shining, the wind is blowing, and you can see with the yellow, the orange, the green there, the output from wind and solar generation is very high throughout the daytime. So the line at the top of the chart there shows the available generation capacity, which is the amount of generation there would be if every facility on the system at that time was producing at its maximum output. So because you're getting a lot of output from your renewables at that time, you can see it's much greater than what is actually needed to meet demand at that point. The second line below it shows the operational demand on the grid. And you can see during the middle of the day that system generation is actually higher than this operational demand, with thermal plant providing ESS in addition to the high renewable output. So we have our battery storage systems coming in and charging, which you can see is the negative entries in purple down below, and soaking up that additional generation. In day 2, by contrast, we can see that although demand is relatively similar to day 1, the renewable output is much lower, which leads to a completely different sort of outcome throughout the day. In this case, the thermal generation fleet fills that gap, as the green and yellow there is close to non-existent. And it generates much more than it was in day 1. We also see the batteries exporting power to the grid to help meet the evening peak as people come from home from work, use more electricity. In fact, at this time, we've almost reached the absolute maximum amount of generation available on the system, necessitating the need for those batteries to come in and help out. And so that brings us to the end of our presentation.